I live alone in a remote suburb of Minnesota. One of those places where the houses are farther apart and the silence at night feels bigger than it should. That week, a heavy snowstorm had covered everything, and the forecasts said the early morning hours would be the worst part. I was working from home at the time and had barely gone out, so my routine was simple. Wake up, work, eat whatever was available, and try to sleep while the wind hit the walls. Around 10 at night, I noticed the garage entrance was already buried in snow again. If I let it build up too much, I knew the morning would be worse. I put on my thick coat, pulled on my boots, and went outside with the shovel, feeling the cold cut into my face as soon as I opened the door. The snow was coming down hard, the kind that erases any sound and makes everything feel muffled. I cleared the driveway slowly, pushing the snow to the sides, my arms getting tired quickly from the weight. I didn't see anyone passing on the street, no cars, no lights on in the nearby houses. Just the wind and the metallic sound of the shovel scraping against the ground. When I finished, I stood there for a second, taking a deep breath, before going back inside. Before I went in, I looked at the backyard almost by reflex. The streetlight illuminated part of the yard, but the snowstorm made everything look slightly blurred, as if the space were smaller than it really was. That was when I noticed something was wrong. There were human footprints in the snow, right in the middle of the backyard. They didn't come from the street or from the side of the house, or from the wooded area behind the property. They simply started there, as if someone had been placed at that exact spot. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand, feeling the cold seep through my clothes while the snow kept falling and didn't erase those marks the way it should have. I moved closer, carefully, looking around to see if there were other footprints connecting that point to somewhere logical. There weren't. Just that single line of steps, well-defined, going straight toward the side of the house. What caught my attention was the size and the regularity. They didn't look like old marks reappearing or some strange effect of the wind. They were recent, deep footprints, like someone had stood there for a few seconds before walking on. My first thought was that I was tired or seeing things wrong because of the light and the storm. Even so, I followed the tracks with my eyes to where they ended. The footprints went straight to my bedroom window, on the side of the house. They stopped exactly there, less than a meter from the wall, as if the person had stood still looking inside. There were no return marks, no deviation, no sign that anyone had walked away afterward. The snow kept falling around the yard, slowly covering everything, but those footprints remained far too sharp to be old. I felt a tightness in my chest and an immediate urge to go back inside. I looked around once more, searching for any movement, any different shadow, but saw nothing but the white falling snow and the flickering streetlight. I went in quickly, locked the door, and stood there for a few seconds, leaning against it, trying to hear something outside. The silence was total, muffled by the snow. I went to the bedroom and stopped before getting close to the window. The curtain was closed like I always left it at night, and there was no sound coming from there. Even so, it felt like I had interrupted something. I lay down without changing clothes, my heart racing, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone had crossed the yard before the storm got worse. Maybe I just hadn't noticed the marks earlier. Still, the image of the footprints starting from nowhere kept coming back to my mind. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. Every gust of wind made the house creak, and any distant sound seemed bigger than it really was. At some point, I woke up with the feeling of being watched, that dry alert that comes without a clear reason. I stayed still in bed, listening. There were no footsteps outside, no creaking wood, nothing hitting the window. Even so, I couldn't shake the idea of someone standing there before, exactly in that spot, looking inside while I was outside clearing the snow. The storm kept going strong, and I thought that when morning came, everything would be covered, and I could pretend none of it had happened. When daylight began to break, I got up slowly and went straight to the bedroom window. I opened the curtain carefully, expecting to see the yard completely white, and it was. The snow had erased all the footprints, leaving no trace at all. The yard looked untouched, smooth, as if no one had ever been there. I felt a brief, almost automatic relief. That was when I noticed something different on the glass. There was a clear mark at chest height on the inside of the window. A handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm there hard enough to leave the outline visible on the cold glass. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The mark wasn't common dirt or random condensation. You could see the shape of the palm and even the base of the fingers, like when someone keeps their hand on cold glass for too long. I placed my own hand next to it to compare, and the size was similar, but the position didn't make sense. I hadn't touched the glass there. I always avoided touching the window in winter precisely because of the cold. And more importantly, the mark was on the inside of the house, not on the outside where someone might have leaned their hand while looking in. The first thing I did was walk through the entire house, still in my pajamas, with that quiet urgency of someone expecting to find something out of place. I checked the front door, the back door, all the windows. Everything was locked. No forced locks, no obvious signs of entry. The floor was clean, no wet footprints, no boot marks, nothing that suggested someone had moved around inside while I slept. That only made it worse. The handprint didn't match a break-in or someone rushing through the house. It felt like something done with time, calmly, inside a space the person already considered accessible. I wiped the glass slowly, more out of nervousness than hygiene, but the feeling wasn't relief. As I wiped, I kept thinking about when that hand had touched the glass. There were only two possibilities. Either it had happened before I woke up while I was sleeping deeply, or it had happened after I went out to clear the snow and came back inside without noticing anything strange. Both options were bad. If someone had been inside while I slept, it meant they made no noise at all and weren't in a hurry. If it happened while I was awake, outside, it meant someone entered my house without me noticing, with the door unlocked long enough for that to happen. I spent the rest of the morning in a strange, half-detached state, trying to follow my normal routine. I made coffee, turned on the computer to work, but my attention kept returning to the bedroom window. Daylight made everything feel too ordinary, almost ridiculous, as if the night had been nothing more than an exaggerated scare. Still, every time I looked at the backyard covered in clean snow without any marks, I remembered the footprints starting from nowhere. Not coming from the street, not coming from the forest, appearing there, as if someone had materialized exactly where they wanted to be. That night, when it got dark again, the house felt different, smaller. There was no new heavy snowfall, just constant cold and the wind moving low between the houses. I left all the lights on, something I never did, and tried to stay awake as long as possible. I sat on the couch with the TV on just to have some human sound in the room. Even so, every time the wind picked up, I caught myself looking toward the hallway that led to the bedroom, imagining the window from the outside, the exact spot where the footprints had stopped. I couldn't stop thinking that someone had been there with a clear purpose, not lost, not by chance. Around midnight, I went to the bedroom window again, this time from inside, and stood there looking out at the yard lit by the exterior light. The snow was smooth, unmarked, exactly like in the morning. I stood there for a few minutes, almost against my will, waiting to see something form in the white, some movement, anything that would give logical meaning to what had happened. Nothing did. I went back to bed with my body exhausted, but my mind too alert to rest. It took a while to fall asleep, and when I finally did, it was heavy and dreamless, the kind that shuts everything off. I woke up to the alarm the next morning feeling weighed down, as if I'd spent the entire night tense. For a second, I thought everything had been an overreaction, a product of exhaustion and isolation. I got up, went straight to the bedroom window and pulled the curtain aside. The yard was still covered in snow, but not as smooth as before. There were irregular marks left by the wind and overnight ice. Even so, there were no visible human footprints. That should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. The total absence of marks reinforced the idea that someone had been there only when they wanted to be, and then disappeared without leaving anything that could be followed or explained. I went to the front door to get the newspaper and felt a strange chill run up my back when I looked at the area in front of the house. The driveway I had cleared the night before was partially covered again, but not enough to hide details. There were no footprints coming from the street to the house. None. It was as if no one had approached the place all night, despite everything I had seen and felt. I went back inside with the feeling of being out of sync with the place, as if the house had gone through something that left no physical record, only memory. I spent that entire day restless, trying to act as if nothing had happened. I worked, made calls, answered emails, all on autopilot. Still, every time I stood up from my chair, I felt the need to look out the window, as if expecting to see something different in the yard. Nothing changed. The snow began to melt in some spots, revealing the dark ground beneath, but no mark appeared that explained the footprints from the previous night. That bothered me more than if I had found clear tracks. The complete lack of explanation made it impossible to close the subject in my mind. The next night, before going to sleep, I checked all the doors and windows more than once. Not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. The handprint on the glass was gone, but the memory remained, as vivid as the moment I saw it. I lay down, trying to keep my eyes open, as if that could prevent anything from happening. Even so, exhaustion won. And as sleep pulled me under, the last image that came to mind was those footprints appearing in the middle of the yard, starting exactly where someone had decided to be, not where they should have been coming from somewhere else. I never found anything like it again after that night. No new footprints, no strange noises, no marks on the glass. Life went on, the snow melted, the yard returned to being just an ordinary yard. Still, something had changed permanently. Whenever it snowed again, I avoided going out at night to clear the driveway. I waited until morning, even if it meant more work. The idea of being outside while someone could be watching from a place that left no trace was unbearable. I started closing the curtains earlier, even during the day, without realizing when that habit began. What bothers me most to this day isn't thinking about who was there, but how. The footprints came from nowhere. The hand was on the inside of the glass. Nothing indicated a break-in, but nothing explained it either. I learned that not everything leaves traces the way we expect, and that some presences don't need a visible entry to be real. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't someone approaching your house, but someone already being there at the exact moment you look, and disappearing before you can prove it wasn't your imagination. Story 2. I've been ice fishing for years and have always been careful. I live in rural Wisconsin and know the lakes in the area well, especially in winter. That night, the forecast didn't indicate anything out of the ordinary, just intense cold. So I decided to walk out to a more remote part of the lake to check some old markers. I was alone, as I almost always am, carrying my gear on my back and moving slowly to feel the firmness of the ice with each step. The snowstorm started suddenly, the kind that falls heavy and fast, reducing visibility within minutes. Even so, it wasn't my first time dealing with that. The wind picked up and the sound of snow hitting my jacket began to swallow every other noise. I was focused on heading back when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A voice, muffled, coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was the wind passing through some crack, but then I heard it again, clearer. Someone was asking for help. And worse than that, the voice said my name. It didn't shout from far away. It called the way someone would when trying to stay calm, repeating my name at short intervals right below my feet. I stood frozen, feeling the cold seep through my boots as I tried to understand what was happening. My first thought was simple. This made no sense at all. There was no one else on that lake that night. I hadn't told anyone I was going out, nor had I spoken to another fisherman in the days before. Even so, the voice continued, clearly coming from beneath the ice, using my name the same way someone familiar would. It didn't sound panicked or desperate. It sounded focused on making me stop there. The sound was muffled, as if it were truly trapped beneath thick layers of ice and water. I instinctively looked around, searching for any sign of another person on the surface. I didn't see anyone. The snowstorm had already closed in on almost everything, and my own footprints were beginning to lose definition. The voice continued for a few seconds and then stopped suddenly, as if someone had decided to fall silent. The lake returned to being just wind, snow, and the distant groan of ice adjusting to the cold. My entire body was tense. I didn't know whether to run, stand still, or try to rationalize it as some kind of auditory illusion caused by the wind and exhaustion. I took a deep breath and decided to move away. Not because I was sure of anything, but because standing still felt like the worst possible choice. I took a few steps back, careful not to slip, keeping my eyes on the patch of ice where the voice had come from. That was when I heard my name again, now closer, as if it were following my movements from below. The voice didn't shout. It spoke in a controlled, almost patient tone, asking for help, saying it was cold, saying it needed to get out. My instincts screamed at me not to respond, not to say anything out loud, as if that might somehow confirm my presence to whatever, or whoever was there. When I finally turned to leave, I started walking faster, feeling my heart pound too hard for the cold. I didn't run, because running on uneven ice is asking to fall. Still, I quickened my pace, focusing on my own footprints so I wouldn't get lost in the storm. The voice stopped completely. That didn't reassure me. On the contrary, the silence felt heavy, like something had changed tactics. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, the way it feels when everything suddenly becomes too quiet. That was when I heard a different sound behind me. It wasn't a human step. It was a dragged, heavy, irregular noise, like something being pulled with effort across the ice. I stopped for a second against all logic and looked over my shoulder. The snowstorm made it hard to see, but I could make out fresh marks on the ice, far too wide to be a person's footprints. They cut across the lake diagonally, not following the same path I had taken. What was most disturbing was the direction. They were moving away from my footprints as if something was moving while I fled, but without trying to reach me on the surface. After that, my body went into automatic mode. I kept walking, now with short, controlled breaths, feeling sweat turn cold beneath my clothes. I alternated my gaze between the path ahead and those marks appearing behind me, showing and disappearing as the snow fell over them. I didn't hear my name being called again. No voice. Just the wind, the snow, and that low, continuous sound of something heavy being dragged somewhere on the lake. Too far for me to see clearly, too close to ignore. With every step, I had the clear sensation that I was no longer alone in that open space, even though I couldn't see anyone. The lake, which had always been a familiar place to me, felt too large and too empty at the same time. The marks on the ice weren't coming toward me, but they also didn't stop. It was as if something was moving with its own purpose, indifferent to my escape. That made me more nervous than if I had been directly chased. At least a chase makes sense. This didn't. I just wanted to get off the lake and reach the shore. Anything solid that wasn't that white, unstable surface. When I finally saw the dark line of the shoreline, I felt immediate relief, almost physical. I took the last steps with extra care and climbed onto the snow-covered ground, feeling solid earth under my boots. Only then did I allow myself to truly stop. I turned to look at the lake one last time, even knowing I probably shouldn't. The storm had already covered almost everything, but I could still see the beginning of the wide marks on the ice, cutting through the white irregularly, heading in the opposite direction of my human footprints. There was no opening in the ice, no visible crack that could explain a voice coming from below. I stood there for a few more seconds, breathing deeply, trying to convince my body that I was safe. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still moving out there, hidden by the snow in the distance. I didn't hear any more sounds from the lake, no dragging, no voice, just the wind and the distant crack of ice adjusting to the cold. That should have ended it, but my mind kept circling back to the strangest detail of all. The voice had used my name, not a nickname, not a generic "hey." My full name, the way very few people use it. And I couldn't think of any plausible explanation for that. I went back home in silence, my body tense and my attention tuned to any sound out of the ordinary. I took off my wet clothes, sat at the kitchen table, and stayed there for a long time doing nothing, just trying to process what had happened. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't even know how to begin explaining it. I heard someone calling me from under the ice. Sounded too absurd to be taken seriously. Still, I knew what I had heard. The tone, the distance, the controlled way the voice spoke. That hadn't been a momentary imagination or an echo of the wind. That night I tried to sleep, but it wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my name again, spoken in that low voice, almost too calm for a plea for help. I kept thinking about how many times I'd heard stories of ice making strange noises, of wind creating auditory illusions, but none of that explained the precision. It didn't explain why the voice seemed to follow my movements or why it stopped exactly when I started to leave for good. I got up a few times to look out the window, even knowing I couldn't see the lake from there. It was more of an automatic gesture, as if watching the darkness could keep something from getting closer. When morning finally came, the world looked far too normal. The storm had eased and the gray morning light made everything quiet and still. Even so, I knew I wouldn't be going back to the lake that day. I spent the entire morning with that alert feeling that won't switch off, as if something had happened outside the normal order of things. Later, when the weather improved a bit, I got in the car and drove to a spot on the shore where I could see part of the road I'd taken. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, no opening in the ice, no clear marks beyond what the snow had already covered. Still, I knew exactly where I had stopped when I first heard the voice. I've never told this story to other fishermen in the area, not because I was afraid of sounding crazy, but because I knew exactly how it would sound. Over time, I realized that what bothered me most wasn't the voice itself, but the way it tried to make me stop. It didn't shout. It didn't beg. It simply called my name, over and over, as if it were certain that would be enough. As if I would recognize that call as something legitimate. To this day, when I remember the scene, I think that if I had answered out loud, if I had stopped for just a few more seconds, that thing might have found another way to get closer. I never walk alone on the lake at night anymore. I still ice fish, but only during the day with other people nearby, and I never go out to the more remote spots. Whenever someone mentions hearing strange sounds in winter, I stay quiet. I know ice makes noise. I know wind carries sound in strange ways. But I also know the difference between a random noise and someone saying your name clearly enough to make you stop. Some things don't want to be seen. They just want you to stay where you are for too long. Story 3. I was driving alone through rural Colorado when the snowstorm worsened too quickly for me to turn back. The GPS lost signal a few times, and I ended up following a secondary road, thinking it would take me back to the main highway. It was night. The wind pushed snow against the car, and visibility became so poor that I could barely see the hood. I was tired, cold, and already starting to feel that dry nervousness of someone who knows they've taken a wrong turn. My phone still had battery, but there was no signal. I stopped a few times just to breathe and try to get my bearings without success. After a few more minutes driving far too slowly, I saw a yellowish light appearing in the middle of the white. As I got closer, I realized it was an isolated house, one of those old ones with 2 stories, a porch, and several lit windows. It didn't look abandoned. On the contrary, it looked lived in and warm, as if someone were inside spending the night normally despite the storm. I parked the car near the entrance, feeling immediate relief at finally seeing some sign of life. I got out carefully, feeling the snow sink to my ankles, and walked up to the front door, knocking hard enough to be heard inside. I waited a few seconds after knocking, trying to hear any response behind the door. Nothing. I knocked again, a bit harder, and announced out loud that my car was stuck and that I needed help. The wind pushed my voice back toward me, which made everything feel stranger. The house remained lit, far too warm-looking to be empty. I moved closer to the door and realized there was no sound coming from inside. No TV, no radio, no conversation. Just the steady light behind thin curtains. That gave me an uneasiness that was hard to explain, like something wasn't matching the scene I was seeing. I went to the first living room window and wiped part of the glass with my glove so I could see better. The house was completely furnished. Sofa, table, bookshelf with books, everything in place, as if someone had just stepped out for a few minutes. As I was looking, I saw a shadow move from the back of the room toward the stairs. It wasn't fast or abrupt. It was a calm human movement, like someone walking normally. I stepped back immediately, feeling my heart race. I knocked on the window with my knuckles, calling out again, but the shadow didn't return. I slowly circled the house, trying to decide whether this was just someone ignoring the door out of fear, or if something was truly wrong. The snowstorm worsened by the minute, and the wind made the porch creak softly. At another window, I saw more shadows moving, 2 this time, passing one another as if people were walking in different rooms. I couldn't hear voices, footsteps, or anything that confirmed real presence. It was only movement behind curtains and fogged glass. I called out again, said my name, asked to use the phone. No one answered. The feeling was of being on the wrong side of something that worked normally for whoever was inside. I decided to leave when the cold began to burn my fingers inside my gloves. I walked back the same path I'd taken from the car to the house, but stopped in the middle of the yard when I noticed something strange on the ground. My own footprints, the ones I'd left walking from the car to the door, were no longer there. The wind had erased some marks around, but not all of them. Even so, the direct path I clearly remembered taking simply no longer existed. Instead, I saw new footprints appearing near the car, several of them, forming an irregular circle around it, as if someone had been walking there while I was at the house, coming and going without moving away. I stood still for a few seconds trying to understand what I was seeing, feeling the wind hit my face and snow slip down the collar of my coat. I looked at the ground over and over, as if my footprints might reappear if I stared long enough. Nothing. The space between the car and the house was too clean for such a recent snowstorm. In contrast, the marks around the car were clear and deep, like people who had walked there calmly, circling, stopping near the doors, moving away and coming back. It didn't look like someone arriving or leaving. It looked like people waiting. My heart started beating far too fast, and the idea that I'd had my back turned to the car for several minutes made me nauseous. I got into the car, almost tripping, slammed the door shut, and turned the key with a trembling hand. The engine took a second to start, and that second felt far too long. While I waited, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the house still lit, motionless, as if nothing had happened. I didn't see anyone in the windows at that moment. No shadows, no movement. Even so, I had the clear feeling that I wasn't alone out there anymore. When the car finally started, I shifted into gear without thinking and began pulling away slowly, feeling the wheels slip in the loose snow. I managed to maneuver the car with difficulty until I lined up with the road, but before accelerating, I looked down at the ground one more time, almost on impulse. The footprints around the car were already becoming less defined, as if the snow were covering them too quickly for something so recent. Still, it was clear they weren't mine. The size, the spacing, the way they moved in circles didn't match my hurried steps. I swallowed hard and accelerated slowly, afraid of losing control, feeling the car respond heavily because of the cold. The house disappeared behind me far too quickly, swallowed by the white curtain of the storm as if it had never been there at all. I drove for several minutes without knowing exactly where I was going, just keeping the car on the narrow road and hoping not to leave it. The feeling of being followed came and went, even without seeing any headlights behind me. At times, I thought I saw something moving along the roadside, shadows stretched by the car's lights, but it could have been just the wind lifting the snow. My body was tense, my shoulders aching, my hands stuck to the steering wheel. I just wanted to reach somewhere familiar, any light that wasn't that isolated house in the middle of nowhere. After a while that felt longer than it really was, I saw the faint reflections of a gas station in the distance. The white lights cut through the snow like a fixed point in the void, and that gave me the strength to keep going. When I pulled into the parking lot, turned off the car and stayed there for a few seconds without getting out, breathing deeply, trying to make my body stop shaking. I looked back one last time, but the road was already swallowed by the storm with no sign of the house or another vehicle. I got out of the car and went into the station, feeling the artificial heat hit my face like a shock. I told the attendant that I'd gotten lost and asked for help at a nearby house. He listened in silence and frowned when I described the location. He said there hadn't been any inhabited house on that road for years, only an old building that sat there abandoned and without electricity. I asked about the lights, about the lit windows. He shook his head, saying that during strong storms many people reported seeing strange things there because of snow reflection and wind. He didn't argue with me, but the way he spoke made it clear he didn't fully believe my version. I left the station as soon as the main road became more visible, not wanting to prolong that conversation. The rest of the drive was tense, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I reached a small hotel in the nearest town, and only then felt the exhaustion finally set in. Even in the heated room, it took me a long time to relax. The image of the lit house, far too silent to be alive, kept returning to my mind. What bothered me most weren't the shadows inside it, but the fact that the house seemed ready, waiting for someone to show up at the door on that specific night. The next morning, when the storm eased, I tried to retrace the route mentally on the map. The road was there, the detour made sense, but there was no record of any house at that point. No property, no address. I searched for images, reports, anything that explained what I'd seen. I found nothing concrete, only vague comments about an old building no one used anymore. The detail of the footprints was the one thing I could never make sense of. Mine had disappeared far too quickly, while others appeared exactly where I needed to be in order to leave. To this day, whenever I drive at night during winter, I avoid secondary roads. Isolated lights in the middle of nowhere no longer bring me relief. I learned that not every house with its lights on is waiting to help someone, and that sometimes the greatest warning isn't what you see when you arrive, but what disappears when you try to leave. Story 4. I was living alone in a small town in upstate New York at the time, working a night shift at a warehouse near the train tracks. It wasn't a dangerous place, just too quiet once it got dark. That night, a snowstorm had started heavier than expected, and transportation was delayed to the point that I decided to walk home. It wasn't the first time I'd taken that route, just over 20 minutes passing through residential streets that were almost always empty. I was tired, my boots were already wet, and the wind was hitting my face. All I could think about was getting home and sleeping. The snow was falling thick, covering everything too quickly, leaving the street white and uneven. My steps sank deeply with each stride, and the muffled sound of snow being crushed was practically the only noise around. It was after a few blocks that I noticed movement behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt that familiar presence you get when someone is too close. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man farther back, walking in the same direction. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I couldn't ignore him. What was strange was the way he moved, far too fast for that amount of loose snow on the ground. I slowed my pace on purpose to see if he would pass me or fall behind. He did the same. The distance between us stayed almost exactly the same, as if he were calculating every movement. I looked down at the ground trying to see his footprints, and that's when something truly started to bother me. While my footprints were deep and uneven, with snow reaching almost up the sides of my boots, his marks were far too shallow. In some spots you could barely see where a foot had touched. It wasn't like someone walking carefully. It was as if his weight wasn't there in the same way mine was. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself maybe he wore different boots or was lighter, but none of that explained the speed. I kept walking, my heart now racing, trying not to show nervousness. The man seemed to glide more than walk, moving forward too quickly without the visible effort that snow demands. I didn't hear heavy breathing or the typical sound of footsteps forcing into the ground. I only saw the dark silhouette slowly getting closer, always right at the edge of the streetlights. At times, I thought I might be imagining things because of the storm and poor visibility, but whenever I stopped for even a second, he stopped too. He didn't hide. He didn't change direction. He just stood there motionless, as if waiting for me to decide to keep going. I started to walk faster, feeling my legs tire even more quickly because of the heavy snow. The cold seemed sharper, or maybe it was just the tension making my body react differently. Even so, the man behind me didn't fall back. He kept the same pace without showing any effort, as if the snow simply wasn't there for him. I looked down again, this time more carefully, and I was sure of what I was seeing. His footprints didn't sink. They were almost a suggestion of footprints, a faint shadow on the white surface, while mine left deep, chaotic holes. That gave me a sick feeling in my stomach, something hard to explain, as if logic itself had slipped along with the snow. I thought about crossing the street to see if he would do the same. I waited until I reached an empty intersection and suddenly crossed over, nearly slipping on the curb. The man crossed right after me at the same point without hesitation, without losing his balance. There was no delay, no extra caution like someone would normally have crossing a snow-covered street. It was far too smooth. At that moment, I stopped trying to find practical explanations. My focus became getting home as fast as possible. The idea of running crossed my mind, but running in that snow would mean falling, and falling would make me far too vulnerable. When I finally turned onto the street where I lived, I felt immediate relief, almost physical. The houses there were low with dim lights on behind curtains, and that gave me the sense of being back in a human space, even though no one was outside. I quickened my pace again, feeling my feet burn from the cold inside my wet boots. I didn't look back right away. I just focused on reaching the front gate, climbing the 3 steps of the porch and getting inside. The sound of snow being crushed under my feet felt too loud in that silent stretch. When I reached the gate, I couldn't resist and looked back. The man was standing in the middle of the street, exactly where the streetlight's illumination ended. He hadn't followed me onto the sidewalk. He hadn't slowly closed the distance. He was simply there, motionless, standing on snow that was practically untouched. Around him, there were no deep marks like mine. The white surface looked almost smooth, as if he had been placed there without walking to that spot. He didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't make any gesture. He just stood there silently as if he had already gone far enough. I stood there for a few seconds holding the gate, my hand aching from the cold, trying to understand whether this was still part of the same situation or if I was already safe. The man didn't come any closer, but he didn't move away either. The snowstorm kept falling around him, slowly covering the street, but it didn't seem to touch the space directly beneath his feet in the same way. The streetlight cast strange shadows around his body, stretching his silhouette and hiding any detail of his face. I couldn't see eyes or expression, just a posture too upright for someone standing in that cold for so long. I went inside quickly, locked the door, and stood there for a few seconds, leaning against it, trying to control my breathing. The silence inside contrasted with the wind outside, giving me a false sense of protection. I walked slowly to the living room window and pulled the curtain just enough to peek out. The man was still there, in the middle of the street, in the same position. He hadn't taken a single step. The snow around him was beginning to cover my footprints, but the area where he stood remained strangely uniform. After a few seconds, I pulled the curtain back, afraid he might realize I was watching. I waited a few minutes before looking again. The kitchen clock read just after midnight, and the house made those normal heating noises, trying to fight the cold. I returned to the window carefully and pulled the curtain once more. The street was empty, the man was gone. There were no footsteps leading away, no deep marks heading anywhere, just the snow covering everything unevenly, as it had been doing all night. That didn't bring me immediate relief. On the contrary, how quickly he had simply stopped being there unsettled me, as if the observation had ended when he decided it had. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the couch with the lights on, listening to the wind hit the walls and the distant sound of a car passing now and then. Several times I thought I might see that silhouette again between the street's shadows, standing under some lamppost. Nothing happened. Even so, I couldn't sleep. The image of those shallow, almost non-existent footprints kept returning. The snow had been deep enough to exhaust me in just a few blocks. It made no sense for someone to move that way without sinking, without slipping, without any effort at all. The next morning, I woke up to gray light coming through the window, and the street covered by a thick layer of snow. Before even making coffee, I went to the front door and looked outside. My footprints from the night before were still there, deep and uneven, leading from the corner to the porch. I followed the path with my eyes to the spot where I had seen the man standing. There was nothing around that indicated another presence. No sequence of shallow steps, no mark of prolonged standing, no trail leading away. It was as if only I had walked down that street during the entire storm, even though I knew that wasn't true. I spent that entire day with a strange feeling of having been assessed, not chased. The man hadn't tried to truly approach, hadn't spoken, hadn't run after me. He had simply accompanied me to the exact point where I would be safe enough to enter my house. Since then, whenever it snows heavily and I need to go out at night, I avoid walking alone. Not because of fear of the cold or slipping, but because I learned that not every presence leaves marks the way it should. Some simply walk beside you until they decide they've seen enough. Story 5. I worked late at a small factory in rural Ohio and depended on the last bus of the night to get home. It was a bad route, with few schedules, and the stop was on a rural road where there was practically nothing but fields and a few houses far apart. That week the snow had come back heavily, covering the shoulder and leaving everything white and silent. I left my shift with my body tired and my hands still smelling of grease, pulled up my hood, and walked to the stop feeling the wind cut into my face. The cold was the kind that gets into your lungs and makes your throat burn. When I arrived, the stop was empty, as it almost always was. Just the metal bench, the bus sign, and the weak light of a street lamp that flickered from time to time. The road looked deserted, no headlights, no nearby houses with lights on. I stood there rubbing my hands inside my gloves, checking the time on my phone and trying not to think about how much I hated that wait. That was when I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the bench right in the middle, there was a child sitting, small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a jacket that was far too thin and no hat, as if they had left home without understanding the cold outside. The first thing I thought was that I simply hadn't seen the child arrive, which was already strange on that empty road. The child was sitting very still, with their feet lightly swinging above the snow, staring fixedly at the road as if waiting for something specific. They weren't using a phone, weren't crying, and didn't seem bothered by the intense cold. That caught my attention immediately, because I myself was shivering despite my thick coat. I looked around for an adult, a parked car, any sign that the child wasn't alone. There was no one. Just the two of us and the wind moving low across the fields. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure whether to say anything. I didn't want to scare them, but it also didn't seem right to ignore it. I asked, in a normal voice, if they were waiting for the bus too. The child didn't turn their head. Didn't answer. They kept staring at the dark road as if I wasn't there. I moved a little closer and noticed that the clothes were far too dry for such a recent snowstorm, too clean for someone who had walked there. Even so, the cold didn't seem to affect them. That gave me immediate discomfort, that feeling that something was out of place, though I still couldn't say exactly what. I decided not to press it. I thought maybe it was one of those situations where a child had been told to wait there by an adult who was delayed, unlikely as that seemed at that hour. I stood beside the bench, keeping some distance, glancing at the road now and then to see if headlights appeared. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and the faint creak of the bench when the child shifted slightly. At a certain point, I noticed that the child wasn't breathing visibly. I couldn't see that white vapor coming from their mouth the way it came from mine every time I exhaled. I tried not to focus on it, but the detail stuck in my head. A few minutes later, I saw the bus lights appear in the distance, cutting through the snow and lighting up the empty road. I felt immediate relief. I stepped forward, already preparing to signal the driver. When I looked back at the bench, the child was no longer there, simply gone. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't see them get off the bench, didn't see them run anywhere. The bench was empty, covered by a thin layer of snow except for 2 clear marks as if someone had just stood up from there. The shape was too small for an adult, but deep enough to show that someone had truly been sitting there. The bus stopped with its usual loud hiss, and the driver opened the door looking straight at me, as if I'd been the only one there for some time. I got on, still looking back, expecting to see the child reappear from some unlikely place, maybe behind the pole or walking down the road. Nothing. Just the empty bench and those 2 marks in the snow, well defined as if the body had left seconds before. I paid the fare almost on autopilot and sat in the first seat, still trying to process what had just happened. My heart was beating far too fast for something that technically hadn't done anything to me. As the bus pulled away slowly, I couldn't help myself and asked the driver if he had seen the child at the stop when he approached. He frowned and glanced quickly in the rearview mirror, as if checking something that was no longer there. He said no, that the stop was empty when he came around the curve. I insisted, said there had been someone sitting on the bench just seconds earlier. He shook his head and replied that at that hour he had never seen any child there, much less one alone in the middle of that road. His tone wasn't mocking. It was genuine confusion. I looked out the window as the bus moved away, watching the stop grow smaller in the darkness. The marks in the snow were still there, visible for a few seconds under the glow of the rear lights before disappearing into the white curtain of the storm. That tied my stomach in a knot. It wasn't something I could have completely imagined. There had been weight there, a physical record that someone had occupied that bench. I turned my attention back inside the bus, trying to convince myself that the cold, the exhaustion, and the isolation had played a trick on me. Even so, the image of the child sitting there, far too quiet, remained sharp in my mind. The ride continued in silence, with only a few passengers scattered in the back. No one seemed to notice my state, and I didn't say anything else. I stared at my own wet gloves, feeling the warmth of the bus slowly return sensation to my fingers, while trying to understand what exactly had happened. The child hadn't seemed lost or scared. They had just seemed to be waiting, and that bothered me more than if they had cried or asked for help. The feeling was that I had interrupted something that wasn't meant for me, just by being there at that specific hour. When I got home, with snow still clinging to the hem of my pants, I went straight to the living room window and stood there looking at the empty street for a few minutes. It was irrational, but I had the feeling that the waiting hadn't ended at the bus stop. The image of the child sitting there, not reacting to the cold, not looking at me, felt too out of place to be just a perception error. The detail of the light clothing kept coming back. No child that age would stand still that long in that cold without complaining, without moving, without showing discomfort. And yet, they had seemed perfectly comfortable, as if the environment had no effect at all. In the days that followed, I tried discreetly asking a few people at work whether anyone lived with children near that stretch of road. No one knew. An older coworker commented that the stop had always been weird because it was far from any house and almost no one used it after dark. He said it laughing, like someone sharing an unimportant curiosity, but that only reinforced my unease. I started avoiding the last bus whenever I could, asking for rides or staying longer at work. It wasn't fear of robbery or violence. It was the sense that if I were there again at the wrong time, I might see something I wouldn't know how to explain or ignore. A few weeks later, on a less cold night, I drove past that stop and slowed down without realizing it. The bench was empty, covered in dirt and old snow, just as it always had been. There was no sign of anyone waiting for a bus there. Even so, my body reacted the same way it had that night, with an automatic tightness in my chest. It wasn't nostalgia or direct fear. It was the feeling that that place had served as a waiting point for something that didn't need the bus to arrive in order to leave, something that only needed someone to be there to see it. To this day, whenever I wait for transportation at night, I pay too much attention to who shares the space with me. Not out of ordinary suspicion, but because I learned that not every presence makes noise, asks for help, or reacts when you speak. Some just sit, stare at the empty road and disappear at the exact moment someone arrives to confirm they were never there. And what bothers me most isn't remembering the child's face, because I barely remember that, but the marks left on the bench and in the snow, proof enough that for a few minutes I wasn't alone at that stop. Story 6. I rented the cabin to spend a weekend alone in the mountains of Montana, more to clear my head than for any kind of adventure. The place was simple, made of old wood, isolated enough that there was no cell service or internet. That was exactly what I wanted at the time. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded the car calmly, and turned on the gas heater. Outside, the snow was already starting to fall heavier, and the silence was so complete it was almost uncomfortable. The cabin had a small living room, a basic kitchen, one bedroom, and an old radio on top of a shelf, something the owner said hardly anyone used anymore. I spent the first few hours doing simple things. I prepared food, organized my things, and lit the fireplace to warm the place up. The snowstorm intensified quickly after dark, and the wind began hitting the wooden walls hard. I was sitting at the table eating when I heard the sharp click of the radio turning on by itself. At first, I thought it was some kind of bad contact because of the age of the device. A low static filled the room, and then a voice came through, far too clear for that old equipment. The voice described exactly what I was doing at that moment, saying that I was sitting eating slowly, looking toward the door from time to time. I froze, fork suspended in the air, trying to understand whether this was some kind of recorded prank or an absurd coincidence. The voice on the radio wasn't dramatic or artificial. It was neutral, almost bored, like someone narrating something obvious. It commented that I had stopped eating, that I was looking at the radio now, and that my hand was shaking a little. At that point, I dropped the fork onto the table, and the dry sound seemed to echo too loudly in the small room. The voice continued, confirming the sound, saying that I had dropped the utensil because I was startled. That erased any doubt that this wasn't something randomly recorded. I stood up slowly and walked over to the radio, keeping my eyes on it as if it were a person. I tried to turn it off by twisting the knob, but the sound didn't stop. The static faded for a second and came back stronger, and the voice commented that I was trying to turn it off, that it wouldn't help. My stomach dropped. I took a step back, feeling the heat of the fireplace on my back and the cold that seemed to creep in through my feet. There was no other sound besides the wind outside, and that broadcast that seemed to be happening in real time, tracking every small reaction of mine. The voice on the radio paused briefly as if waiting for something, and then continued describing the environment. It talked about the lit fireplace, the smell of burning wood, the sound of the wind hitting the walls outside. Every detail was far too accurate. It wasn't a generic description, it was specific, intimate, as if someone were inside the cabin with me, observing everything closely. I felt a chill run up the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the temperature. I looked around instinctively, to the door, to the snow-covered window, to the hallway leading to the bedroom. The cabin was still empty, but the feeling of being alone had completely disappeared. I asked out loud who was speaking. My own voice sounded strange, muffled by the enclosed space. The radio responded almost immediately, saying that I didn't need to know that right now. It said I should stay exactly where I was, that standing still was better. The calm way it said that made me more nervous than if it had been a direct threat. The storm outside seemed to have intensified, and the wind pushed snow against the windows harder, as if it were trying to get in as well. I felt my heart beating far too fast, and I had the clear sense that any wrong movement would be noticed. I took a few slow steps toward the door, more out of instinct than any plan. The radio immediately commented that I was moving away from the table and heading in the wrong direction. It said it wasn't a good idea to be near the door that night. I stopped halfway, feeling the cold floor under my boots. The voice didn't sound irritated or urgent. It sounded merely informative, like someone correcting a simple mistake. That gave me a strange feeling of being guided, not threatened. Even so, the fear was there, solid, tightening my chest. I moved back a little without taking my eyes off the door and stood still in the center of the room. The radio crackled for a few seconds, and then the voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but still perfectly audible. It said the storm had closed off the way back, that no one would reach the cabin that night, and that I should pay attention to what came next. The silence after that was too heavy. For a few seconds, I thought the transmission had ended. Then the voice said with absolute clarity, "Do not open the door when I knock." As soon as the sentence ended, the radio turned itself off with a sharp click, plunging the cabin into near total silence. The fireplace was still crackling, but it felt distant. I stood there trying to understand what I had just heard, repeating that sentence in my head as if it might reveal some hidden meaning. My first impulse was to run to the door and lock it more securely, but my body simply didn't respond. I felt a strange pressure, as if any movement were being watched, even with the radio off. I looked at the door, then at the snow-covered windows, and tried to listen for something outside. Nothing. Just the wind and the low creak of the wood. Then the knocking came. They weren't loud or desperate. They were firm, spaced knocks directly on the front door. 3 clear knocks done with control, like someone who knew exactly how much force to use. My stomach twisted instantly. There was no voice, no request for help, just the dull sound of wood being struck from outside. The knocking stopped and the silence returned even heavier. I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, remembering the final sentence of the broadcast in the calm way it had been delivered, like a warning rather than a threat. A few seconds later, the knocking returned at the same rhythm, on the same spot on the door. It didn't get stronger or faster. It was as if whoever was outside was simply confirming something. I walked slowly back to the table and sat down because my legs started to give out. The fireplace crackled softly, and I could hear the wind slipping through the gaps in the wood, but no footsteps on the porch, no creaking that suggested someone moving. Just those occasional knocks, always the same, always controlled. At some point I realized I was holding my breath every time the sound came, as if the silence between one knock and the next was more frightening than the noise itself. The knocking stopped after an amount of time I can't measure. There was no farewell, no final sound. I stayed sitting there for long minutes, waiting to hear something move away, but it never happened. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, or the wind changing direction, or anything that suggested the presence had gone. The cabin simply became too quiet again. I looked at the radio several times, expecting it to turn on again, but it stayed off. The sentence kept echoing in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking that it hadn't been an attempt to make me open the door, but exactly the opposite. I spent the rest of the night awake, not going near the door or the windows. At times I thought I heard something very distant. Maybe the wind hitting at a different angle, maybe branches giving way under the weight of the snow, but nothing I could say for sure. The strangest part was the feeling that the most important decision had already been made before the knocking even started. The transmission hadn't asked for anything. It had only informed, as if the warning wasn't meant to protect me, but to ensure that something continued exactly as it should that night. When morning came, the storm had eased significantly. Gray light came through the windows and the cabin went back to looking like just an ordinary cabin, isolated and quiet. I worked up the courage and opened the door slowly. The porch was covered in clean snow. No boot prints, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there hours earlier. I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing. No trail leading away, no disturbed area. Just the light wind and the dry mountain cold. I went back inside, turned everything off, gathered my things, and left before noon. To this day, I've never turned that radio on again. In fact, I avoid any place where there's no signal and where the silence feels too attentive. What bothers me most isn't thinking about who knocked on the door, but the fact that someone knew exactly what I was doing, when I was doing it, and what I shouldn't do afterward. Some warnings don't come to scare you. They come to make sure you stay exactly where you are without opening the door. Story 7. I was driving alone along a rural road in the interior of North Dakota when the snowstorm became too heavy to ignore. That stretch was long and straight, with no lighting, surrounded by open fields and patches of low woodland. I had already slowed down significantly, hands firm on the steering wheel trying to keep the car centered in the lane while the snow blew sideways and erased any reference points. The radio picked up only static. My phone had no signal, and I was counting the minutes until I reached a familiar area. Fatigue and cold blended together, slowing my thoughts and tightening my focus. That's when I saw something dark in the middle of the road a few meters ahead. I slammed on the brakes and the car slid a bit before stopping. In the headlights, it looked like a human body lying there, partially covered in snow, far too still to be a road-killed animal. My stomach dropped immediately. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do, instinctively looking around as if expecting to see another car or someone waving. There was nothing but wind and snow. I took a deep breath, turned off the engine, and stepped out of the car, feeling the cold bite into my face the moment I opened the door. I walked slowly toward what looked like the fallen person, sinking with each step into the loose snow. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own blood in my ears. I got close enough to make out the outline of a dark coat and what could have been a shoulder crusted with ice. I called out loudly, asking if the person was okay, if they could hear me. There was no response. The position was strange, like someone who had lain down on their side and not tried to get up. The snow didn't seem built up enough to suggest they'd been there for hours, which made me even more nervous. Still, I took one more step closer, leaning forward, ready to help. Everything happened too fast for me to fully process. The body moved all at once in a sudden motion that didn't match someone who was injured. In less than a second, the figure stood up completely and ran toward the trees along the side of the road. It didn't trip, didn't slip, didn't hesitate. It ran like someone who knew exactly where they were going, even with deep snow and poor visibility. I stepped back by reflex, nearly falling, hit by a sharp jolt of fear. I didn't hear any shout, any word, just the quick sound of something cutting through the snow and vanishing into the trees. I stood there in the middle of the road for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart was pounding too hard, and my hands started shaking from cold and shock combined. I looked toward the tree line, expecting to see some movement, some flash of clothing or the sound of footsteps moving away. Nothing. The snowstorm swallowed everything quickly, and the darkness between the trees felt solid. I instinctively looked down at the ground, trying to find some explanation there. That was when I noticed something even more wrong. Around the spot where the person had been lying, there were no footprints besides my own. No marks of someone standing up, no trail of a run toward the trees. Just my own steps, deep and uneven, forming an irregular circle around the point. That changed the fear into something else. It wasn't just the shock of someone fleeing, it was the clear sense that this hadn't worked the way it should have. I had seen someone stand up and run, but the ground didn't confirm it. The loose snow should have recorded every step, every push-off, especially during a run. But there was nothing. I took a few more steps around, searching more carefully, using the headlights to scan the ground. The more I looked, the clearer it became that only I had left marks there. That tightened my chest and gave me an immediate urge to get back to the car, as if staying in that spot was a serious mistake. I hurried back, slipping a little in the snow while trying not to fall. I got in, slammed the door, and started the engine immediately, feeling a strange relief at the familiar sound of the car. I sat there for a few seconds, breathing deeply, headlights still aimed at the stretch of road where everything had happened. The road was empty again. There was no sign of anyone on the pavement, on the shoulder, or in the trees. If it weren't for my still racing heart, I might have believed I'd imagined it all. I put the car in gear and started moving slowly, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting to see a shadow appear behind me. I drove for several minutes without looking to the sides, focused only on keeping the car on the road. The snowstorm was still heavy, but now there was an urgency that hadn't been there before. At one point, I slowed down and checked the mirror again. There was nothing behind me except snow being swallowed by darkness. Even so, that didn't reassure me. The total absence of tracks on the ground kept hammering in my mind. I had seen someone run, but the world around me insisted it had never happened that way. After a while, I reached a stretch of road a bit more sheltered from the wind and pulled over onto the shoulder, just to steady myself. My hands were still shaking, and I turned off the wipers for a few seconds so I could hear my own breathing. I got out again, despite the fear, and walked a few steps back, following my own footprints. They were there, clear and deep, leading from the car to the point where I'd stopped to help. But when I reached the exact spot, I saw again that there were no other marks besides mine. No trace of someone lying down, no sign of someone getting up, no tracks fleeing toward the trees. It was as if the ground had decided to record only my presence in that scene. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling the cold seep through my clothes and the silence press in on my ears. The idea that I'd simply mistaken something felt too weak to comfort me. I had seen the body stand up. I had seen the short, decisive run toward the dark line of trees. That hadn't been a shadow or a reflection from the headlights, and yet the ground confirmed nothing. I went back to the car without looking toward the trees again. I had a clear sense that if I stayed there too long, I would be repeating exactly the mistake someone wanted me to make. This time I drove without stopping, ignoring the fatigue and cold, focused only on getting out of that area. Every curve felt longer than it should have, and I slowed down whenever the headlights lit up anything different on the road, even if it was just a pile of snow pushed by the wind. My mind kept returning to the scene, trying to force logic where there was none. I thought about someone pretending to be injured as a cruel prank, but nothing explained the complete lack of footprints. I thought about a large animal, but the way it stood up didn't match. The more I thought, the clearer it became that no simple explanation solved everything at once. After a few more kilometers, I reached a stretch where the road passed near an isolated farm, with a faint light on in the distance. That small sign of human presence brought immediate relief. I didn't stop, but knowing someone was awake nearby changed the feeling of being completely alone. Even so, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the rearview mirror from time to time, expecting to see someone appear behind me, walking down the middle of the road or stepping out of the trees. I never saw anything. The snowstorm gradually lightened and the wind eased, as if the night itself were calming down after what had happened. I only truly stopped when I reached a small town, with a gas station still open and enough lights to push away the sense of isolation. I parked and stayed inside the car for a few minutes, watching people come and go as if nothing unusual had happened that night. My boots were still covered in snow, and when I got out, I noticed the soles were wet from prolonged contact with the cold. I went inside the station, bought a coffee just to have something warm in my hands, and stood there trying to organize my thoughts. I considered telling someone what had happened, but I didn't even know where to begin without sounding too strange. When I finally got home hours later, it was still dark. I parked in the garage and looked at the ground before getting out. The tire marks were there, normal, predictable. I walked to the door and went inside, feeling a heavy exhaustion settle over my body. Before sleeping, I took off my boots and noticed that the snow stuck to them had formed small puddles on the entry mat. The marks from my own footsteps were the only ones there as well. I don't know exactly what I saw on that road, but I know that someone, or something, wanted me to stop. And I know that if I had stayed outside the car for a few more seconds, there might not have been any footprints of mine left to prove I'd been there. In the days that followed, I tried not to think about it too much. I told the story vaguely to a friend without details, and got exactly the reaction I expected. Awkward silence, followed by a poorly fitted rational explanation. I tried to accept it myself, that it had been fatigue, the snowstorm, my mind playing tricks in the dark. But there was one detail I couldn't shake. I had stepped out of the car believing someone needed help. It had worked too quickly. There was no hesitation, no request, no normal human reaction, just a precise movement, as if the goal had only been to get me out of the vehicle. A few weeks later, I had to pass through that region again during the day. The road looked ordinary, even boring. There were no strange marks, no signs of anything out of place. I stopped the car at an approximate spot where everything had happened and stepped out for a few seconds. The trees were dense, hard to move through, especially running in snow. I stood there looking at the dry ground, imagining how it must have looked covered in white that night. I went back to the car with a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. Since then, whenever I drive at night and see something on the road, I stop the car at a distance, keep the engine running, and never get out immediately. Some things don't want help. They just want you to take the first step.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.